In a world where self-worth is often measured by external approval, Sarah Parker, a quiet but determined high school student, finds herself up against relentless challenges. Facing a teacher who undermines her voice, Sarah's journey through self-doubt and struggle becomes a powerful testament to courage and integrity. Prejudice in the classroom. Teacher underestimates student without knowing her parents' influence invites readers into a gripping story of resilience, where Sarah learns that true strength lies not in others' validation but in embracing her own values, no matter the cost. Join us on this journey of self-discovery as Sarah confronts prejudice, finds her voice, and inspires those around her. Will she emerge from these trials stronger, or will the weight of expectation hold her back? If you believe that everyone deserves respect and opportunities, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Sarah adjusted the strap of her backpack as she looked up at the imposing facade of Willow Springs High School. It was her first week at the new school, and she didn't know anyone yet, but she was determined to do her best. Her parents had always taught her the importance of education and keeping her head held high, no matter the challenges. The literature classroom was buzzing with students whispering and exchanging curious glances, all noticing the new girl. Sarah knew that fitting in wouldn't be easy, but she kept a timid smile and a hopeful gaze. She took a deep breath as the teacher walked in, a tall woman with gray hair and a critical gaze that swept over the students' faces. "Good morning, class. I trust everyone is ready for another literature lesson," announced Ms. Roberts with an authoritative tone as she tapped her attendance book on the desk, silencing any lingering murmurs in the room. Sarah felt Ms. Roberts' eyes rest on her for a brief moment, and she returned the gaze with a small nod. But what she received in return was a cold, disapproving look, making her hesitate. Throughout the lesson, Ms. Roberts spoke passionately about literary concepts, emphasizing the importance of interpreting texts deeply. Sarah, always attentive, raised her hand to participate when Ms. Roberts posed a question about the poem they were studying. For a moment, Ms. Roberts ignored Sarah's raised hand and called on another student instead. Sarah, still determined, kept her hand up, waiting patiently. Finally, Ms. Roberts turned to her, wearing an expression that seemed impatient. "Yes, Sarah, do you have something to add?" Ms. Roberts asked, her tone edging on disdain. Sarah swallowed but responded confidently, "I think the poem is about freedom and how important it is to fight for your rights, even when the world seems against you." Ms. Roberts raised an eyebrow and let out a brief, almost dismissive chuckle, prompting a few students nearby to laugh softly. "Interesting, but that's a rather simplistic interpretation. Perhaps you should try to think a bit more profoundly," she replied before moving on to the next student. Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her composure, trying not to let her discomfort show. This was just one of many interactions where Ms. Roberts would either ignore her contributions or make subtle remarks that left her feeling out of place and undervalued. Sarah quickly realized that, for some reason, her presence seemed to bother Ms. Roberts, though she couldn't quite understand why. In the following days, Ms. Roberts intensified this behavior. Whenever Sarah raised her hand, she was often ignored, and even when she managed to speak, Ms. Roberts would belittle her answers with thinly veiled sarcasm. With each class, Sarah felt a growing tension, as if she were walking on eggshells. She started to wonder if she had done something wrong, but she knew she was giving her best. At home, she would mention the classes lightly to her parents, omitting the discomfort she felt, not wanting to worry them. Her father, the school's principal, had always encouraged Sarah's independence and believed she could face any challenge. Meanwhile, Ms. Roberts continued her subtle methods of exclusion. Over the weeks, she organized group activities and frequently left Sarah out, claiming that the groups were already complete. Sarah, maintaining her composure, followed the instructions and tried her best to stay engaged, even if it meant working alone on group projects. However, Ms. Roberts' attitude didn't go unnoticed by the classmates. Some students began to pick up on her negative treatment of Sarah. Though they didn't dare to confront Ms. Roberts' authority, glances and whispers began circulating around the room, creating an uncomfortable and even more isolating environment for Sarah. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. As the days passed, Sarah continued to participate in class, despite the dismissive responses from Ms. Roberts. One crisp autumn morning, as the class began their analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, Sarah felt a sense of connection to the themes in the novel and was eager to share her thoughts. She had stayed up the previous night, taking notes and preparing to offer her insights. Ms. Roberts began the lesson with her usual rigid demeanor, scribbling notes on the board as the students jotted them down. "Now," she said, turning to the class with a stern gaze, "who can tell me why To Kill a Mockingbird is considered a controversial novel?" Several hands shot up, including Sarah's. Ms. Roberts called on a boy at the front of the room, who hesitated before offering a response. It's controversial because of racism," he ventured uncertainly. "Yes, partially," Ms. Roberts replied, pursing her lips. "But I'm looking for more depth." Her eyes scanned the room again, landing on Sarah, who was practically brimming with enthusiasm. "Sarah?" she asked with a faint smirk. Sarah cleared her throat, feeling the weight of her classmates' stares. "I think it's controversial because it challenges people to look at their own biases. It forces readers to confront uncomfortable truths about justice and equality." Ms. Roberts raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Interesting interpretation," she replied slowly. "Though I'd caution against simplifying such a complex work. Sometimes, surface-level readings do more harm than good." The words hung in the air like a cold draft, stinging Sarah. She glanced down, her cheeks warming as she clenched her pen tightly. One of her classmates leaned over, whispering loud enough for her to hear. "Guess that answer wasn't good enough either." Ms. Roberts tapped her pen on the desk, redirecting the class's attention. "Now, let's discuss Scout's character development. Who can explain her role in the story?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she decided not to raise her hand this time. Yet, Ms. Roberts seemed to notice her hesitation. "Sarah, since you seem so eager to participate today, why don't you enlighten us about Scout?" Ms. Roberts's tone was clipped, almost mocking. Sarah swallowed, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Well, I think Scout represents a child's innocent view of the world and how it's slowly shaped by the injustices she witnesses." Ms. Roberts interrupted with a sigh. "Once again, you've missed the nuances here. Scout isn't just an innocent bystander. Her character reflects a broader societal struggle." Sarah felt her throat tighten, and the weight of humiliation grew heavier with each word. She forced herself to maintain her composure, even as she sensed the stifled laughter around her. Another student raised his hand, offering a different perspective. Ms. Roberts beamed, nodding in approval. "Now, that's what I'm looking for. Insight, depth, an interpretation that goes beyond cliches." Sarah's heart sank. Every response she gave seemed to fall short of Ms. Roberts's approval, no matter how much effort she put in. She felt like she was standing on a stage under a harsh spotlight, every word scrutinized and dismissed. After class, as students gathered their things, a friend approached her quietly. "Don't let her get to you, Sarah. We all see how she treats you." Sarah forced a small smile, though the lump in her throat remained. "Thanks, but I don't know why she's singling me out." Her friend shrugged, glancing back at Ms. Roberts, who was arranging papers at her desk. "She probably thinks you're just an easy target." The next day, during a group discussion, Ms. Roberts circulated around the room, listening to each group's ideas. When she reached Sarah's group, she stopped, crossing her arms. "Sarah, since you have so many thoughts on the book, perhaps you'd like to lead this discussion?" Sarah hesitated, sensing the challenge in her teacher's tone. I was thinking that maybe Atticus represents moral courage, the strength to stand up for what's right, even if it's not popular." Ms. Roberts tilted her head, the slightest sneer on her face. "Moral courage, you say? I'd be careful about throwing around such big words if you're not sure what they mean." Sarah's face burned, and the other students looked away, uncomfortable. She could feel her voice waver, but she held her head high. "I do understand what it means, Ms. Roberts. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Ms. Roberts's eyes narrowed. "Let's hope that's true," she replied curtly, moving on to the next group without another word. As Sarah gathered her things after class, She overheard Ms. Roberts speaking to another teacher in the hallway. Some students, Ms. Roberts said, her voice carrying through the corridor, just don't know when to stop. They think they're so insightful, yet they miss the point entirely. It's almost tiresome. Sarah knew the words were meant for her, and she felt the sting of humiliation tighten around her. She took a deep breath, whispering to herself, "Don't let her get to you. Just keep going." The halls were filled with the sounds of students chatting, lockers slamming, and footsteps echoing. Yet for Sarah, the noise felt distant, as if she were moving through a fog. She gripped the strap of her backpack, focusing on each step as she made her way to the library. Sitting down at a quiet table, she pulled out her notebook, determined to keep studying. She reminded herself of her goals, of her parents' belief in her potential. She wouldn't let Ms. Roberts' harshness derail her dreams. But in the back of her mind, the sting of Ms. Roberts' words lingered, casting a shadow over her confidence. For now, all she could do was hold on to her determination, even if it felt like she was standing alone in the battle. Sarah sat quietly in the school library, her notebook open in front of her, though her mind was far from the pages. The words of Ms. Roberts echoed in her head, twisting her thoughts into knots. She stared at her notes on To Kill a Mockingbird, but all she could feel was a dull ache, the residue of every cutting remark and dismissive look. The soft hum of the library buzzed around her. The shuffling of books, the scratch of pencils, the distant murmur of students whispering to each other. But Sarah was absorbed in her own silence. "Sarah," a familiar voice broke through her fog. She looked up to see her friend, Mia, standing beside her. Mia's eyes were soft, concern etched into her expression. "You okay?" Sarah managed a small nod. "Yeah, just studying," she replied, though even she could hear the strain in her voice. Mia slid into the chair across from her, lowering her voice. "Look, everyone can see how Ms. Roberts treats you. It's not fair, and honestly, it's not right." Sarah's gaze dropped to her hands, clenched tightly on the table. "Maybe she's just trying to push me harder. Maybe I'm not good enough," she whispered, barely loud enough for Mia to hear. Mia shook her head. "No, Sarah, you're one of the smartest people I know. She's singling you out, and it's wrong. Have you thought about telling someone? Like your parents?" Sarah hesitated. Her father was the principal, after all. She didn't want to seem like she was running to him for every problem. Besides, she didn't want to worry her parents. "I don't know, Mia. I don't want to cause trouble." Mia sighed, her hand reaching out to cover Sarah's. "Standing up for yourself isn't causing trouble. It's making sure you're treated with respect." That evening, Sarah sat at the dinner table with her parents, pushing her food around her plate. Her father, Mr. Johnson, noticed her quiet demeanor. "Sarah, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but attentive. Sarah looked up, seeing the concern in his eyes. She debated whether to share her struggles, but felt the words bubbling up. It's Ms. Roberts. She just doesn't seem to like me, Dad. Every time I try to answer in class, she either ignores me or says I'm wrong, even if I think I'm right." Her father's brow furrowed. "Do you feel she's treating you differently than other students?" Sarah hesitated, the weight of the day pressing down on her. "Yes, it's hard to explain, but it feels like nothing I say is ever good enough for her. And the way she looks at me, it just feels uncomfortable." Her mother reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "Sweetheart, we're proud of you for speaking up. You don't deserve to feel like this, especially in a place where you're there to learn." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression serious. "I'll look into it, Sarah, but you should also remember that no one's opinion can take away your worth. You're smart, kind, and capable. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Sarah smiled, comforted by her parents' support. But as she went to bed that night, Ms. Roberts' voice still lingered in her mind, a shadow that refused to disappear. The next day, in literature class, Ms. Roberts assigned a group presentation. Sarah was paired with two other students who had watched her struggles with Ms. Roberts in silence. As they gathered their materials, one of the students, Kyle, leaned in. "Hey, just so you know," he whispered, glancing nervously at Ms. Roberts, "I think you're brave for standing up to her." Not everyone would keep raising their hand after the way she talks to you. Sarah offered him a grateful smile, though her heart was still heavy. Thanks, Kyle. It hasn't been easy. As they worked, Ms. Roberts circled the classroom, observing each group. When she reached Sarah's group, she paused, folding her arms. Sarah, I expect a thorough analysis from your team, Ms. Roberts said, her tone sharp. No simplistic observations this time, all right? Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she looked directly at Ms. Roberts. We're working hard on it, Ms. Roberts. Ms. Roberts's gaze lingered, a thin smile curving on her lips. Good. Make sure it shows. When she walked away, Kyle whispered, What's her problem? Sarah shook her head. I wish I knew. That afternoon, after classes, Sarah found herself alone in the library again, flipping through her notebook. The words on the page blurred as tears pricked her eyes. She had tried so hard to stay strong, to prove her worth. But with every passing day, the strain grew heavier. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice. Sarah. Her father's voice brought her back. Mr. Johnson stood at the entrance, concern etched into his face. I had a talk with Ms. Roberts today. Sarah's heart raced. What did she say? Mr. Johnson sighed, sitting down across from her. She insists she's treating you like any other student. But I made it clear that I expect every student at this school to be treated with respect. Sarah's shoulders slumped. I don't know if that will change anything, Dad. She just doesn't like me. I can feel it. Her father reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sarah, don't ever doubt yourself. She may be your teacher, but that doesn't give her the right to make you feel less than you are. You're a bright young woman, and I won't stand by and let anyone make you feel otherwise. The words gave Sarah a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But as she looked out the window, watching the leaves drift down from the trees, a part of her knew the struggle wasn't over yet. Sarah walked down the bustling hallway, her gaze fixed on the floor as snippets of conversation floated around her. Students hurried past, chatting and laughing, their words mixing into an indistinct hum. But Sarah barely registered any of it. Her thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the web of Ms. Roberts's criticisms and her own self-doubt. Sarah. Mia's voice cut through the noise. Sarah looked up to see her friend hurrying toward her, concern evident in her eyes. Hey, Sarah greeted, forcing a small smile. Mia glanced around, her voice dropping to a whisper. Did you hear? Ms. Roberts was talking about you to some other teachers. She said you lacked critical thinking skills and that you're overly confident for no reason. Sarah's face flushed. She said that? Mia nodded, frustration darkening her expression. It's so unfair, Sarah. She's supposed to be your teacher, not your enemy. Sarah sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. I just don't get it. I've done everything I can to prove myself, but it's never enough. Mia put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Maybe it's time you stop trying to win her approval and start focusing on yourself. You don't owe her anything, Sarah. In the following days, the tension between Sarah and Ms. Roberts seemed to permeate the classroom. During a particularly heated discussion about symbolism in literature, Ms. Roberts singled Sarah out yet again. Sarah, she said, her voice dripping with impatience, why don't you share your thoughts on the symbolism in The Great Gatsby? Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on her. I think the green light represents Gatsby's unreachable dreams, his hope for a future that he can never quite grasp. Ms. Roberts interrupted, her voice laced with disdain. Unreachable dreams? That's a rather shallow interpretation, don't you think? The air in the room grew thick with tension as students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she forced herself to hold Ms. Roberts's gaze. With all due respect, Ms. Roberts, Sarah replied, her voice steady but soft. I believe that was Fitzgerald's intention. The green light symbolizes the futility of Gatsby's pursuit. Ms. Roberts's eyes narrowed. If that's truly what you believe, I suggest you read the text again. Maybe this time, try reading with a bit more insight. The words stung, sharp and cutting, as the class watched in silence. Even Kyle, usually talkative, looked down, unwilling to meet Sarah's eyes. When the bell finally rang, Sarah gathered her things quickly, trying to hide the tears threatening to spill. As she left the classroom, she heard Ms. Roberts mutter, "Some students just lack the humility to learn." Sarah stopped, her hand clenched tightly around the strap of her bag. She felt the urge to turn around, to defend herself, but the weight of exhaustion held her back. She walked away, her heart heavy with disappointment. That evening, at home, Sarah's parents noticed her subdued mood. After dinner, her mother sat beside her, her gaze gentle but probing. "Sarah, honey, you seem so distant lately. Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Sarah hesitated, feeling the familiar sting of Ms. Roberts's words. "It's just Ms. Roberts again. She's been saying things that make me feel like I'm not good enough." Her mother's face softened. "Sweetheart, I know it's hard, but you are more than capable. Ms. Roberts may be your teacher, but her opinion doesn't define your worth." Sarah looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "I just don't know what to do. It's like, no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to change her mind." Her father, listening from across the room, cleared his throat. "Sarah, some people will judge others no matter what. Your job isn't to prove them wrong. It's to stay true to yourself." Sarah nodded, though a small part of her felt deflated. She wanted so badly to prove herself, to earn Ms. Roberts's respect. But as she went to bed that night, her father's words echoed in her mind. Stay true to yourself. The next day in class, Ms. Roberts assigned an essay on the themes of resilience and personal strength in literature. Sarah couldn't help but feel the irony. She poured her heart into the essay, staying up late to make sure every word captured the essence of her argument. She focused on characters who, despite adversity, found strength within themselves, a theme that felt painfully close to home. When Ms. Roberts returned the graded essays a few days later, Sarah's heart raced with anticipation. But as she unfolded the paper, her chest tightened. In red ink, at the top of the page, Ms. Roberts had written, "Lacks depth. Revisit your approach." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words. She had put everything into that essay, pouring her frustrations, her hopes, her fears into every sentence. And yet, it was dismissed in a single line. After class, Sarah found herself lingering, waiting for the room to empty. She approached Ms. Roberts's desk, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Ms. Roberts," she began, her voice shaking slightly, I worked really hard on that essay. I don't understand why it wasn't good enough." Ms. Roberts looked up, her expression unreadable. "Sarah, effort is commendable, but effort alone doesn't equate to quality. Perhaps you need to push yourself harder, dig deeper." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. "I did dig deep, Ms. Roberts. I wrote about resilience because it's something I try to embody every day." Ms. Roberts raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, dismissive smile. "Resilience, Sarah, is more than just a word. It's a concept that requires understanding beyond your years." The words felt like a slap, each one chipping away at her confidence. Sarah fought back tears, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I'll try harder." Ms. Roberts gave a curt nod, already dismissing her as she turned back to her papers. Later, as Sarah left the school, Mia caught up with her, noticing the defeated look in her eyes. "Sarah, what happened?" Mia asked, worry etched into her face. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. I tried talking to her. I thought if I explained how much this means to me, maybe she'd see that I'm doing my best. But she just said I need to dig deeper, that I don't understand resilience." Mia's expression turned angry. "She has no right to treat you like this, Sarah. It's not fair. She's trying to break you down." Sarah looked at her friend, feeling the weight of her words settle on her. "But what can I do, Mia? She's my teacher. If she says I'm not good enough, maybe I'm not." Mia grabbed Sarah's hands, her grip firm. "Listen to me. You are enough. Don't let her make you feel small." Sarah nodded, trying to hold on to her friend's words. But as she walked home that day, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Ms. Roberts's words held more power than she wanted to admit. The next week, Sarah walked into class with a mixture of dread and determination. She was still haunted by the conversation with Ms. Roberts after her essay critique, but something in her refused to back down. She reminded herself of her father's words, "Stay true to yourself," and tried to hold on to them as tightly as she could. Ms. Roberts entered the room and announced, "Class, today we'll be presenting our essays on resilience and personal strength. Each of you will read an excerpt, and I expect insightful commentary, not just surface-level observations." Sarah's stomach twisted. She hadn't anticipated having to share her essay aloud, especially after Ms. Roberts's brutal feedback. The thought of standing up in front of her peers and reciting the very words Ms. Roberts had dismissed felt like standing on a stage without a safety net. One by one, students stood up, reading their essays. Ms. Roberts occasionally interjected with comments, nodding approvingly for some while offering suggestions for others. Finally, she looked directly at Sarah. "Sarah, would you care to share your insights on resilience with us?" Ms. Roberts's tone held that familiar edge, as if daring Sarah to falter. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she rose from her seat. She could feel every eye on her, the classroom suddenly much too quiet. "Resilience," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is about finding strength within yourself, even when everything seems to be against you." She hesitated, glancing briefly at Ms. Roberts, whose expression was unreadable. As she continued, Sarah's voice gained confidence. "Resilience is the courage to keep going, to hold on to hope even in the darkest moments. It's knowing that your worth isn't defined by others, but by the strength you find within." Ms. Roberts interjected, her tone sharp. "And do you believe you understand resilience, Sarah?" The question caught Sarah off guard, and her voice faltered. I think so. I try to embody it every day." Ms. Roberts's lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting. But resilience also requires the ability to accept criticism and improve, don't you think?" Sarah swallowed, feeling the weight of Ms. Roberts's words press down on her. She nodded slightly, though the fire in her chest burned brighter. "Yes, Ms. Roberts. I believe it does." Ms. Roberts raised an eyebrow, seeming satisfied with her response. "Good. Now, let's continue." The sting of Ms. Roberts's remarks lingered long after class ended. Sarah gathered her things slowly, trying to hold back tears. But as she reached the door, she overheard Ms. Roberts speaking with another teacher. "Some students think they understand resilience just because they've read about it," Ms. Roberts scoffed. "They lack the life experience to grasp true hardship." Sarah's heart sank, her hands tightening around her backpack straps. The words felt like a slap, a reminder that in Ms. Roberts's eyes, nothing she did would ever be enough. After school, Sarah sat in her usual spot at the library, attempting to study. But her mind kept replaying Ms. Roberts's words, each one cutting deeper than the last. She barely noticed when Mia sat down beside her, her friend's face filled with concern. "Sarah, are you okay?" Sarah looked up, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't know, Mia. I thought I was, but I'm starting to feel like maybe Ms. Roberts is right. Maybe I don't understand resilience. Maybe I don't have what it takes." Mia's eyes flashed with anger. "No, don't even think that, Sarah. Ms. Roberts has no right to make you feel like this. She's supposed to help you, not tear you down. But what if she's right?" Sarah's voice broke. "What if I'm just not good enough?" Mia placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, her voice firm. "You are more than good enough. She's just trying to make you doubt yourself. Don't let her win." Sarah took a shaky breath, nodding. "I'll try." The following day, Ms. Roberts announced that the class would be doing an impromptu group debate on themes of justice and fairness in literature. As fate would have it, Sarah found herself paired with 3 other students, all of whom were well aware of her struggles with Ms. Roberts. As they gathered their notes, Kyle leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, we've got your back. Ms. Roberts can't treat you like this forever." Sarah managed a small smile. "Thanks, Kyle. That means a lot." Their group took turns presenting their points, discussing themes of justice in various novels. But as Sarah prepared to speak, she noticed Ms. Roberts watching her, her gaze colder than usual. When Sarah began her argument, discussing the portrayal of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird. Ms. Roberts interrupted. Sarah, she said, her tone clipped. I would appreciate it if you stuck to the facts rather than injecting personal feelings. The words felt like a punch, silencing Sarah mid-sentence. She looked around, her classmates watching with expressions of discomfort and sympathy. I was discussing the themes in the novel, Ms. Roberts, Sarah stammered. Ms. Roberts's smile was thin. Perhaps, but you need to remain objective. This is an academic exercise, after all. Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the sting of humiliation washing over her. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she was only trying to engage with the text. But the words died in her throat. When the class finally ended, Sarah felt drained, every ounce of her confidence stripped away. As she packed her things, Mia approached, her expression a mix of sympathy and anger. This isn't fair, Sarah. You deserve better than this, Mia said, her voice fierce. Sarah forced a weak smile. I don't know if I have anything left to give. It's like, every time I try, she just finds a way to make me feel small. Mia hugged her, her arms wrapped tightly around Sarah. You're not small, and you're not alone. Don't ever forget that. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the day over and over. She thought about her essay, about Ms. Roberts's dismissive smile, and the way her words seemed to linger, clawing at her self-esteem. But she also thought about Mia's words, the unwavering support of her friend, and the quiet encouragement from classmates like Kyle. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a reason to keep fighting. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes, clinging to the small flicker of hope that remained. Ms. Roberts sat at her desk after school hours, the classroom empty and silent. She tapped her pen against the pile of papers she still needed to grade, her gaze drifting to the window where the setting sun cast long shadows across the room. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a sigh, one of exhaustion mixed with frustration. Sarah Johnson's face flashed in her mind, and her jaw clenched. There was something about that girl, her persistence, her confidence, that set Ms. Roberts on edge. She remembered her own struggles in high school, fighting tooth and nail for every ounce of recognition and respect. But in her mind, Sarah had done little to earn that respect. She was too outspoken, too bold for someone her age. The door creaked open, and Mr. Klein, a fellow teacher, stepped in, holding a cup of coffee, burning the midnight oil again. Roberts? Ms. Roberts offered a tight smile. You know how it is, Klein. Some students think they know it all. Klein chuckled, taking a seat across from her desk. I heard you've been having some trouble with that Johnson girl. Principal's daughter, isn't she? Ms. Roberts's eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, and it shows. She thinks she can waltz into my classroom and lecture me on resilience as if she's experienced hardship. Klein shrugged, sipping his coffee. Kids these days. But, maybe she just needs a bit of guidance? Ms. Roberts bristled, the suggestion hitting a nerve. Guidance, sure, but it's not my job to coddle them. If she wants to prove herself, she has to earn it. Resilience isn't something you get by being the principal's daughter. Klein gave her a sympathetic nod. Well, maybe she'll learn that the hard way. As Klein left, Ms. Roberts felt a flicker of satisfaction. In her mind, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was teaching Sarah an important lesson, one she wished someone had taught her at that age. The next day, Sarah entered the classroom, her gaze downcast but determined. She was still shaken by the previous day's events, but she knew she had to keep going. She took her seat, bracing herself for whatever Ms. Roberts had in store. Ms. Roberts began the lesson with her usual intensity, explaining the themes in A Tale of Two Cities. Her gaze occasionally flicked towards Sarah, watching her reactions, almost as if she were testing her. As the lesson progressed, Ms. Roberts posed a question about sacrifice and redemption, her tone challenging. Who here believes that sacrifice always leads to redemption? Sarah's hand went up, hesitantly at first, but with growing confidence. Ms. Roberts's eyes narrowed as she called on her. Yes, Sarah? I think sacrifice can lead to redemption, but it depends on the intent. If someone sacrifices for selfish reasons, it may not lead to true redemption. Ms. Roberts tilted her head, a faint smile playing on her lips. So, you're saying sacrifice is only noble if the intent is pure? Sarah nodded. Yes. If it's self-serving, it's not truly a sacrifice. Ms. Roberts leaned forward, her gaze intense. Interesting. But tell me, Sarah, do you think you're qualified to judge what's truly selfless or not? Sarah blinked, caught off guard. I don't know if I can judge it, but… Ms. Roberts interrupted, her voice growing cold. Perhaps that's something to consider. Sacrifice is not a concept that can be easily understood by those who haven't experienced true hardship. Sarah felt the sting of her words, but she held her head high. I may not have lived through as much as others, but I believe anyone can understand empathy and the value of selflessness. Ms. Roberts gave a curt nod, moving on with the lesson, but Sarah could feel the tension lingering in the air, thick and unyielding. Later, as the students filed out, Sarah stayed behind, gathering her things slowly. She felt a presence beside her and looked up to see Ms. Roberts standing there, her expression unreadable. Sarah, Ms. Roberts began, her tone softer but still guarded. Why are you so insistent on speaking up in my class? Sarah's heart pounded, but she met her teacher's gaze. Because I want to learn. And I thought part of learning was sharing ideas and perspectives. Ms. Roberts crossed her arms, a hint of irritation flashing in her eyes. Sharing ideas is one thing, but sometimes there's a value in restraint. In listening before you speak. Sarah's cheeks flushed. I do listen, Ms. Roberts. But I also believe in standing up for what I think is right. Ms. Roberts studied her for a moment, a mixture of frustration and something else. A glimmer of respect, perhaps, flickering across her face. Perhaps. But be careful, Sarah. Confidence is admirable, but arrogance is not. With that, she turned and left, leaving Sarah standing alone in the empty classroom, her thoughts swirling. That evening, Ms. Roberts sat in her apartment, replaying the interaction in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about Sarah's resilience that reminded her of her younger self, a version of herself she had tried to bury. She thought about her early years, struggling to prove herself in a world that seemed indifferent. She had fought to gain the respect of her peers and had little patience for anyone who hadn't been through the same struggles. But the image of Sarah's determined face, her unwavering gaze, lingered. There was a strength there, something she hadn't expected to see in someone so young. It bothered her, unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully understand. As she sat alone, the quiet of her apartment pressing in, she wondered, just for a moment, if perhaps she had misjudged Sarah. But the thought was fleeting, replaced by the familiar armor of pride and the conviction that she was doing the right thing. The following week brought a slight shift in the atmosphere. Sarah noticed it when Ms. Roberts didn't cut her off during class or make any sarcastic remarks when she raised her hand. In fact, Ms. Roberts even nodded at one of Sarah's comments, acknowledging her perspective without the usual dismissive tone. Sarah's heart soared, the subtle change filling her with a glimmer of hope. Maybe, she thought, maybe she's finally starting to see that I'm trying my best. Encouraged, she focused even harder on her assignments, pouring hours into her next essay on resilience, determined to demonstrate that she had truly taken Ms. Roberts' feedback to heart. As she submitted her essay, Sarah glanced at Ms. Roberts, who looked back with a neutral expression. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't disdain either, a small victory in Sarah's eyes. 2 days later, Ms. Roberts called Sarah up to her desk after class. Sarah, she began, her tone unreadable. I've looked over your essay. I can see that you've made an effort to incorporate some of my feedback. Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride. Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I really tried to dig deeper this time. Ms. Roberts nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I can see that. Your writing shows more introspection. It's an improvement. Sarah's chest swelled with pride, and for a moment, it felt like all the struggles, all the humiliation, had been worth it. But then, Ms. Roberts continued, her tone shifting slightly. However, you're still missing the mark on certain aspects. Your analysis, while improved, still lacks the depth I expect at this level, she said, setting the essay down on her desk. It's a good start, but not quite there yet. The words hit Sarah like a cold gust of wind. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but the sting of disappointment seeped through. "I understand," she replied, her voice quiet. "I'll keep working on it." Ms. Roberts nodded curtly. "Good. Remember, Sarah, real growth requires humility. Don't mistake pride for progress." The hopeful glimmer that had brightened Sarah's week dimmed, replaced by a familiar heaviness. She forced herself to nod, thanked Ms. Roberts, and left the classroom, clutching her essay with a grip so tight it crinkled the pages. Later that evening, as Sarah sat in her room, staring at the essay in her hands, the faint praise mingled with the criticism replayed in her mind. She had thought, for a brief moment, that she was finally breaking through, finally earning Ms. Roberts' approval. But it seemed as though every step forward was followed by another setback, leaving her feeling trapped in an endless cycle of striving and falling short. The next day at lunch, Sarah sat with Mia, who quickly noticed the clouded look on her face. "Hey," Mia began, nudging her gently. "What happened? You look like you've been through a storm." Sarah sighed, resting her chin on her hands. "Ms. Roberts told me my essay was better, but then she went on to tell me it still wasn't good enough. I don't understand, Mia. I thought I'd finally done something right." Mia's brows knitted together in frustration. "She can't keep doing this to you. She gives you just enough to keep you hoping, and then she yanks it away." Sarah's eyes filled with frustration. "I thought maybe if I showed her I was trying, if I proved that I was willing to listen and improve, but it's like she just doesn't want me to succeed." Mia reached across the table, squeezing Sarah's hand. "She's the one with the problem, Sarah, not you. But if you keep trying to win her approval, you're just going to wear yourself down." Sarah nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. "I know, but it's hard not to feel like I'm failing." Mia's gaze softened. "You're not failing, Sarah. You're showing strength every single day by walking into that classroom and holding your head high. That's resilience, even if Ms. Roberts can't see it." Later that week, the school held a parent-teacher night, and Sarah's parents planned to attend. Her father, the principal, usually refrained from attending events in an official capacity to avoid conflicts of interest, but he made an exception to support Sarah. As the parents and teachers gathered in the auditorium, Sarah felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Maybe, she thought, her parents' presence would make a difference. Maybe Ms. Roberts would see that Sarah had people in her corner, people who believed in her worth and potential. Ms. Roberts stood at the front of the room, addressing the parents and outlining her expectations for her students. Sarah watched as her teacher's gaze swept across the audience, landing momentarily on her parents, before quickly moving on. After the general presentation, the teachers sat at individual tables to discuss student progress with the parents. Sarah sat beside her parents, waiting for their turn with Ms. Roberts. When they finally reached the table, Ms. Roberts greeted them with a formal smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she began, her tone polite but distant. "It's nice to meet you both." Sarah's father extended his hand, his expression warm but firm. "Likewise, Ms. Roberts. We wanted to talk with you about Sarah's progress. She's been working hard, and we're proud of her." Ms. Roberts nodded, maintaining her composed demeanor. "Yes, Sarah has shown improvement. She's clearly putting in the effort, and I commend that." Sarah's mother leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We appreciate your feedback, Ms. Roberts. But Sarah has been feeling discouraged. She feels as though no matter what she does, it's not enough." Ms. Roberts' expression didn't waver. "I understand. Growth can be challenging, and I believe in pushing students to reach their potential. My intention is to help Sarah develop her critical thinking skills, to encourage her to look beyond the surface." Sarah's father's gaze turned serious. "We want Sarah to be challenged, but we also want her to feel supported. Education should inspire, not undermine a student's confidence." Ms. Roberts paused, her eyes flicking towards Sarah. "I see," she replied, her tone careful. "I assure you, my methods are meant to push Sarah to realize her capabilities. I don't give praise easily, but when it's earned, it's deeply meaningful." Sarah's heart sank. The conversation had veered exactly where she had feared. Ms. Roberts was firm in her approach, unmoved by her parents' concerns. Ms. Roberts concluded the meeting with a thin smile. Sarah has potential. I have high expectations for her, and I'm sure she'll continue to make progress. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. As they left the table, Sarah's father looked at her, his expression concerned. Sarah, we're proud of you, no matter what anyone says. Don't let this define how you see yourself. Sarah nodded, holding back tears. But as they walked out of the auditorium, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ms. Roberts would never see her as enough. In the days following the parent-teacher conference, Sarah felt the weight of disappointment heavier than ever. The subtle hope she'd clung to had been dashed, leaving a hollow ache that seemed to grow with each passing day. Even her father's words of encouragement echoed faintly, unable to break through the fog of discouragement. The support from her friends was the one thing that kept her going, especially Mia. As they sat together in the library after school, Mia noticed Sarah's distant look. Earth to Sarah, Mia teased gently, nudging her. Where'd you go just now? Sarah forced a small smile. I'm here, just thinking. About Ms. Roberts? Mia guessed, her expression softening. Sarah nodded, letting out a sigh. It's just, she makes me feel like nothing I do is good enough. And the worst part is, I feel like I'm letting everyone down. My parents, myself. Mia shook her head firmly. Sarah, listen to me. You're not letting anyone down. Ms. Roberts doesn't get to decide your worth. Sarah's eyes dropped to the table. I know you're right, but it's hard to remember that sometimes. Mia reached out, covering Sarah's hand with hers. I'll keep reminding you then. Every day if I have to. The warmth in Mia's words brought a flicker of comfort to Sarah's heart. She managed a genuine smile, squeezing Mia's hand in gratitude. That weekend, Sarah's parents suggested a family dinner, sensing that she could use a break. They took her to her favorite restaurant, hoping the familiar setting might lift her spirits. As they sat around the table, her father studied her, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. Sarah, he began gently, we know things with Ms. Roberts have been challenging, but your mother and I are incredibly proud of you. Sarah bit her lip, feeling the familiar sting of frustration. But I just feel like I'm failing. No matter how hard I try, it's never enough. Her mother reached across the table, placing a hand on her arm. Honey, your value isn't measured by anyone else's approval. You're working hard, and that's what matters. Her father nodded. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're here for you every step of the way. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and helplessness. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to make it better. Her father's expression turned thoughtful. Sometimes, the answer isn't about changing someone else's mind. Sometimes, it's about finding your own peace. Sarah pondered his words, a faint glimmer of understanding stirring within her. She didn't have to keep seeking Ms. Roberts' approval. She could focus on her own growth, on the things she believed in. As they finished dinner, Sarah felt a little lighter, as if a small weight had been lifted. Her parents' words stayed with her, a quiet reminder that she had people who believed in her, even when she struggled to believe in herself. The following Monday, during lunch, Mia and Sarah sat on the bleachers by the soccer field, soaking in the crisp autumn air. Mia had brought an extra slice of chocolate cake from home, hoping it might cheer Sarah up. So, Mia said, handing Sarah the slice, you're looking a little better today. Did the weekend help? Sarah took a bite, savoring the sweetness. Yeah, actually, my parents reminded me that I don't need Ms. Roberts' approval. I need to believe in myself. Mia grinned. Now that's the Sarah I know. You've got this. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the soccer players practice on the field. But then Mia turned to Sarah, her expression hesitant. Can I ask you something, Sarah? Of course. Mia hesitated, biting her lip. Have you ever thought about talking to the principal? I mean, he's your dad, but he's also the principal. Maybe he could step in and help. Sarah's face tightened at the suggestion. I don't know, Mia. It feels complicated. I don't want him to think I'm running to him every time something's wrong. Mia nodded, understanding. I get it, but just remember, he's there if you need him. And so am I. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for her friend. The constant support Mia offered filling her with a renewed sense of strength. "Thanks, Mia. You're the best." In the days that followed, Sarah focused on her schoolwork with a newfound determination. She poured herself into each assignment, not for Ms. Roberts' approval, but for her own sense of accomplishment. It wasn't easy. Ms. Roberts' criticisms still stung, but Sarah tried to let them roll off her shoulders, holding on to her parents' and Mia's words. But one afternoon, during a group discussion in class, Ms. Roberts' words broke through her defenses once more. "Sarah," Ms. Roberts said, her tone sharp, "I asked for a detailed analysis, not a summary. If you can't provide the depth required, perhaps it's best to let others take the lead." Sarah felt the familiar sting of humiliation, her classmates' eyes on her as Ms. Roberts moved on without waiting for a response. After class, Sarah sat at her desk, her hands clenched tightly around her notebook. Kyle, one of her classmates, approached hesitantly, his face filled with sympathy. "Sarah, that was rough," he said softly. "She's really pushing you." Sarah forced a weak smile. "Yeah, but it's fine. I'm getting used to it." Kyle shook his head. "You shouldn't have to. You're doing great, and it's unfair that she keeps treating you like this." Sarah glanced at him, surprised by his support. "Thanks, Kyle. It means a lot." As they left the classroom, Sarah felt a glimmer of solidarity from her classmates. Maybe she wasn't alone in this battle, after all. That evening, as Sarah sat in her room, she pulled out her notebook, flipping through the pages filled with notes and assignments. She thought about everything she'd learned, the insights she'd gained despite Ms. Roberts' criticisms. A thought began to form in her mind, a realization that her growth wasn't defined by one person's opinion. She opened a blank page, writing at the top, "Why I keep going." And with each line she wrote, her confidence grew stronger, as if the words on the page were lifting a weight from her shoulders. As she finished, Sarah sat back, a sense of peace washing over her. She didn't need Ms. Roberts' validation. She needed to believe in herself, in her resilience and her own worth. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a quiet certainty settle within her, a small but powerful voice reminding her that she was enough. The days seemed to blend together as Sarah tried to hold onto her newfound resolve. Each morning, she repeated her father's words to herself. "Your value isn't defined by others' approval." But Ms. Roberts' presence in the classroom was a constant challenge, and Sarah had to dig deep to stay focused on her own growth. One chilly Wednesday, Ms. Roberts announced a surprise project, a class debate on the theme of personal responsibility in classic literature. She would assign roles, with students required to argue perspectives they might not necessarily agree with. As Ms. Roberts read out the team assignments, Sarah's name was called alongside Kyle, Mia, and another student, Jenna. They would be arguing against the idea that characters in literature are solely responsible for their own downfall. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. It was an argument she felt strongly about. Ms. Roberts divided the class into their groups, giving them time to organize their thoughts. Sarah immediately took charge, suggesting themes and examples from various novels. Her mind buzzed with ideas, and her teammates seemed receptive, each contributing their perspectives. Just as they were hitting their stride, Ms. Roberts approached their group, her expression stern. "Sarah," she began, her tone cold, "I'd like to see you after class." Sarah's heart dropped, but she nodded, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Ms. Roberts left them to continue, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled over her. When the bell rang, Sarah stayed behind as her classmates filed out, each glancing at her with sympathetic or curious looks. Mia gave her an encouraging squeeze on the shoulder before leaving, and Sarah took a deep breath, bracing herself. Ms. Roberts sat at her desk, her expression unreadable as Sarah approached. "Sarah," she began, her tone clipped, "I've noticed that you've taken quite a leading role in the group discussions. Would you agree?" Sarah nodded cautiously. "Yes, Ms. Roberts. I thought I could help by organizing our ideas." Ms. Roberts raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. But tell me, do you believe that taking charge is always the most effective way to contribute?" Sarah hesitated, caught off guard. I thought it would help our team stay focused." Ms. Roberts' lips tightened. "Perhaps. But leadership also requires listening and respecting others' input." Have you considered that your approach might be stifling your teammates? The accusation hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She tried to keep her voice steady. I didn't mean to make anyone feel that way. I just wanted us to do well. Ms. Roberts nodded, her gaze unwavering. Intentions are one thing, Sarah, but actions have consequences. Take care to reflect on how your behavior might impact those around you. As Sarah left the classroom, Ms. Roberts' words echoed in her mind. Was she really overstepping? Was she pushing her teammates too hard? Doubt gnawed at her, overshadowing the excitement she had initially felt for the debate. That afternoon, Sarah sat in the library with Kyle, Mia, and Jenna, preparing their arguments. But Ms. Roberts' words weighed heavily on her, and she found herself holding back, reluctant to take the lead as she usually would. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mia asked, noticing her unusual silence. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. I don't want to take over. I want to make sure everyone's voice is heard." Kyle gave her a reassuring look. "Hey, we're a team. We all know you're great at organizing stuff. Don't let what Ms. Roberts said get to you." Jenna nodded, adding, "Yeah, you've been helping us stay on track. I don't feel stifled at all." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude, her friend's words like a balm to her wounded confidence. She nodded, encouraged, and together, they worked through the final points of their argument, each taking turns to speak and refine their ideas. The day of the debate arrived, and Sarah's team took their positions, facing off against the opposing group. Ms. Roberts watched from the back of the room, her gaze sharp and focused, making Sarah's nerves flutter. As the debate began, each team member presented their arguments confidently. Sarah felt a sense of pride watching her friends speak with conviction, their points weaving together seamlessly. When her turn came, she took a deep breath, launching into her prepared argument. Characters in literature often face complex circumstances beyond their control, Sarah argued, her voice strong. It's simplistic to blame them solely for their downfalls when external forces, societal expectations, and even fate play a role. Ms. Roberts interrupted, her voice cutting across the room. "Sarah, do you really believe that people have no control over their choices? Isn't that a convenient excuse?" Sarah faltered, momentarily thrown by the question. I believe that while we do make choices, those choices are often influenced by factors beyond our control." Ms. Roberts' eyes narrowed. "So, you're suggesting people are powerless, mere victims of circumstance?" Sarah's cheeks flushed. "No, that's not what I mean. I'm saying that our environment shapes us, and sometimes people are forced into situations where the odds are stacked against them." The room fell silent as Sarah's words hung in the air. Ms. Roberts' expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Disapproval, perhaps, or disappointment. After a moment, Ms. Roberts gestured for the debate to continue, but Sarah's confidence had taken a hit. The interruption left her feeling as if her perspective had been dismissed yet again, her voice lost in the void of Ms. Roberts' expectations. After the debate, Sarah walked out of the classroom, her shoulders slumped. Mia caught up with her, her expression sympathetic. "Sarah, you did great," Mia said, giving her a supportive smile. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Mia. I wish Ms. Roberts didn't always twist my words. It's like nothing I say is ever right." Mia's gaze hardened. "She's the one who's wrong, not you. Don't let her make you doubt yourself." But the doubt had already taken root, creeping into Sarah's thoughts and making her question everything she had said. As she walked home that day, Ms. Roberts' criticism replayed in her mind, each word a reminder of the seemingly insurmountable expectations placed on her. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, trying to focus on her homework, but her mind kept wandering back to the debate. She felt trapped in a cycle of doubt and frustration, her confidence eroding with every encounter with Ms. Roberts. Her father knocked gently on her door, peeking inside. "Sarah, everything okay?" She looked up, her expression weary. "I don't know, Dad. I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Her father walked over, sitting beside her. "Ms. Roberts again?" Sarah nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She's always challenging me, making me feel like I'm wrong about everything. I try so hard, but it's like she just doesn't want me to succeed." Her father's gaze softened, and he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, sometimes people push us for reasons we don't understand, but that doesn't mean you have to carry their expectations as your own burden." Sarah took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "I'll try to remember that." Her father smiled, a warmth in his eyes that reminded her of her own strength. "Good. And remember, we're proud of you, no matter what." As Sarah lay in bed that night, her father's words resonated in her mind. She didn't have to let Ms. Roberts's criticisms define her. She could forge her own path, separate from the shadows cast by others' judgments. But even as she drifted off to sleep, the uncertainty lingered, a faint echo of doubt that refused to disappear. As the days passed, Sarah found herself weighed down by a persistent sense of exhaustion. No matter how hard she tried, Ms. Roberts's words clung to her mind, each one chipping away at the resolve she had fought so hard to build. Her classmates continued to offer support, but their encouragement seemed like distant echoes against the backdrop of her own self-doubt. One afternoon, after a particularly draining class where Ms. Roberts had made yet another cutting remark, Sarah headed to the library to study. She sank into her usual seat, the quiet of the library a brief respite from the turmoil in her mind. She opened her notebook, but the words blurred on the page, her concentration fraying at the edges. "Hey!" Mia's voice pulled her back to the present as she slid into the seat across from her. "You looked like you were a million miles away." Sarah managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I guess I was." Mia studied her, her expression full of concern. "Sarah, I'm worried about you. You've been so distant lately. It's like Ms. Roberts has gotten under your skin." Sarah looked down, her fingers tracing absent circles on the table. "She has, Mia. I feel like I'm losing myself. Every time she criticizes me, I start to wonder if maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just not good enough." Mia's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't say that. You're more than good enough. Ms. Roberts has no right to make you feel like this." Sarah let out a shaky breath, the words she'd kept bottled up spilling out. "But what if she's right? What if I've been fooling myself this whole time? I thought I was strong, that I could handle this. But it's breaking me, Mia." Mia reached across the table, gripping Sarah's hand tightly. "Listen to me. Ms. Roberts is one person who, for whatever reason, has chosen to make things difficult for you. But that doesn't mean you're wrong or weak. It means she's wrong." Sarah swallowed, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "I just don't know how much more I can take. It feels like I'm fighting a battle I can't win." Mia's expression softened, and she squeezed Sarah's hand. "You don't have to do this alone. We're all here for you. And you don't need to prove anything to Ms. Roberts. She doesn't define you." That evening, as Sarah sat at the dinner table with her family, her mother noticed the tired look in her eyes. "Sarah, honey, are you getting enough rest?" her mother asked gently. Sarah nodded, though the truth was she hadn't slept well in days. Her mind was constantly racing, replaying every criticism, every dismissive glance from Ms. Roberts. "I'm fine, Mom. Just school stuff." Her father's gaze turned serious. "School stuff or Ms. Roberts?" Sarah hesitated, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her emotions. "It's her. I don't know what to do. I keep trying, but it feels like nothing I do is ever enough for her." Her father reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Sarah, you don't need to change who you are to satisfy someone else's expectations. You're intelligent, compassionate, and resilient. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Her mother nodded in agreement. "You've come so far, Sarah, and we see how hard you're working. Sometimes people project their own issues onto others. Ms. Roberts's actions reflect on her, not on you." Sarah looked at her parents, their words wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "Thank you. I wish it didn't hurt so much." Her mother's face softened. "It's okay to feel hurt, but don't let that hurt change the person you are. Remember that you have people who believe in you, no matter what." That night, Sarah lay in bed, her parents' words lingering in her mind. She thought about all the ways Ms. Roberts had challenged her, the way she had doubted herself because of one person's opinion. She knew her parents were right. Ms. Roberts' actions were a reflection of her own issues, not Sarah's shortcomings. But the knowledge didn't make the pain any less real. In an attempt to clear her mind, Sarah pulled out her journal, a safe place where she could pour out her thoughts without fear of judgment. She began writing, her pen moving swiftly across the page as she documented every frustration, every doubt, every flicker of strength she could still grasp. "I am enough," she wrote, the words bold and defiant. "I don't need anyone's approval to know my worth." But even as she wrote the words, a small voice in the back of her mind questioned their truth. She knew she wanted to believe them, but Ms. Roberts' criticisms had left scars that didn't fade easily. The following day, Sarah arrived at school feeling a mix of determination and apprehension. She knew she had to face Ms. Roberts, to continue pushing forward even if the obstacles seemed insurmountable. In class, Ms. Roberts assigned a project that required each student to present a critical analysis of a chosen novel, connecting its themes to real-world issues. Sarah chose To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel that resonated deeply with her for its exploration of justice and prejudice. As she prepared her presentation, Sarah poured her heart into her analysis, determined to capture the complexities of the story and how its themes mirrored her own experiences with injustice. She practiced her presentation in front of her mirror, rehearsing each line, every word carrying the weight of her struggles and her resilience. When presentation day arrived, Sarah stood at the front of the class, her hands steady but her heart pounding. She glanced at Ms. Roberts, whose expression was as inscrutable as ever, and took a deep breath. To Kill a Mockingbird explores the impact of prejudice and the courage it takes to stand against injustice, Sarah began, her voice strong. The characters are faced with challenges that test their morals, forcing them to choose between conformity and what they believe is right. She continued, her passion growing with each sentence. She spoke about the importance of empathy, the struggle for fairness, and the resilience required to hold onto one's principles in the face of adversity. As she finished, the room was silent, her classmates watching her with a mixture of admiration and respect. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Ms. Roberts' response, hoping for a flicker of acknowledgement, even if only for her own satisfaction. Ms. Roberts' eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She gave a single nod, then looked down at her notes. "Thank you, Sarah. Now, let's move on to the next presentation." The words were like a punch, dismissive and cold, erasing the small victory Sarah had hoped to feel. She returned to her seat, the sting of disappointment settling in her chest. She had given her best, shared a part of herself, but once again, Ms. Roberts had found a way to diminish her efforts. After class, Mia caught up with her, her expression one of frustration. "I can't believe she didn't say anything." "You were amazing, Sarah." Sarah shrugged, trying to hide the hurt. "It's fine. I didn't need her validation." But even as she said the words, a hollow feeling gnawed at her, the familiar ache of wanting something she knew she could never have. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at her journal. She flipped to the page where she had written, "I am enough," the words bold and unwavering. But now, in the quiet of her room, they seemed fragile, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the silence fill her. She didn't need Ms. Roberts' approval. She reminded herself of that. But the journey to truly believe it felt longer and more difficult than she had ever imagined. In the solitude of her room, she whispered the words to herself, a quiet affirmation in the darkness. "I am enough. I am enough." And this time, as the words lingered in the air, they felt a little closer to the truth. The following week, tension filled the air in Sarah's literature class. Ms. Roberts had assigned an in-depth analysis of each student's chosen novel, and Sarah, eager to showcase her growth, had poured herself into the assignment. She crafted a carefully detailed analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, addressing themes of morality, empathy, and justice in ways that resonated with her own experiences. She reviewed her work multiple times, hoping to produce an essay that would finally reflect her hard work and depth of understanding. When the day came to submit the assignment, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism. She handed her paper to Ms. Roberts, catching a brief look from her teacher before moving to her seat. There was no smile, no acknowledgement, but Sarah reminded herself that she didn't need Ms. Roberts' validation to be proud of her work. 2 days later, Ms. Roberts returned the graded essays, distributing them one by one with brief comments. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched the stack of papers dwindle until Ms. Roberts finally reached hers. But instead of handing it directly to her, Ms. Roberts paused, holding Sarah's essay up for the class to see. "I want to address something important here," Ms. Roberts began, her gaze sweeping over the students before resting on Sarah. "When writing an analysis, it's crucial to approach the text with objectivity and not allow personal biases to color the interpretation. Sarah, for instance," she continued, holding up the essay, "seems to have mistaken her personal beliefs for critical analysis, resulting in a lack of academic rigor." The word struck Sarah like a slap. She felt her cheeks flush, her hands clenching tightly around her notebook as a silence fell over the room. The weight of every gaze in the room bore down on her, intensifying the humiliation. "Sarah," Ms. Roberts continued, her voice stern, "would you care to explain how your argument about empathy relates directly to the text, rather than your own perspective?" Sarah felt a surge of panic, her mind racing as she tried to piece together an answer. She looked down, feeling the sting of shame prickling her skin. I thought that empathy was a major theme in To Kill a Mockingbird," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about understanding others, seeing life from their perspective, just like Atticus teaches Scout." Ms. Roberts' gaze hardened. "But that's a simplistic view, isn't it? Empathy isn't the only theme in the novel. Your analysis should have gone beyond surface-level observations." Sarah's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak, feeling a flicker of defiance rise within her. "I don't think it's a surface-level observation. I believe empathy is a core message of the book." Ms. Roberts' eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a cold, cutting tone. "Belief isn't a substitute for academic analysis, Sarah. Perhaps you do well to learn the difference." The dismissal in her tone felt final, as if closing a door Sarah had desperately tried to pry open. She could feel her classmates' eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, others with pity, but she couldn't bring herself to look up. When the bell rang, Sarah gathered her things as quickly as possible, barely able to hold back the tears that blurred her vision. She made it to the bathroom before her composure cracked, the weight of Ms. Roberts' words crashing down on her like a wave. Mia found her later that day, sitting alone by the bleachers, her shoulders slumped and her expression hollow. "Sarah," Mia whispered, sitting beside her, "I heard what happened in class. Are you okay?" Sarah shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't understand, Mia. I worked so hard. I put everything I had into that essay, and she just tore it apart. It's like nothing I do is ever good enough for her." Mia wrapped an arm around her, her gaze fierce with anger. "Sarah, she's wrong. She's targeting you, and it's not fair. You're one of the smartest, most thoughtful people I know. She can't see that." Sarah's shoulders shook, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I'm just not as good as I thought." Mia pulled back, looking her directly in the eyes. "Don't you dare believe that. Ms. Roberts doesn't define your intelligence or your worth. She's one teacher, Sarah. You don't have to carry her judgment forever." Sarah took a shaky breath, letting Mia's words sink in. A part of her wanted to believe them, to let go of Ms. Roberts' harsh words. But the weight of those criticisms still clung to her, refusing to release its hold. That evening, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at her essay. The red marks Ms. Roberts had left felt like scars on the page, each one a reminder of her supposed inadequacy. She thought about everything she had done, every moment spent questioning herself, wondering if she was ever going to be good enough. Her father knocked on the door, his voice gentle. "Sarah, may I come in?" She nodded, quickly brushing away the tears that had slipped down her cheeks. Her father entered, his expression concerned as he sat beside her. "Your mom told me what happened in class," he said softly. "Do you want to talk about it?" Sarah hesitated, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I feel like I've tried everything, and no matter what, Ms. Roberts finds a way to make me feel like I'm nothing." Her father's eyes filled with sadness as he placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you are far from nothing. You are smart, resilient, and you have a kind heart. Ms. Roberts may not see that, but we do." Sarah looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "It just hurts so much." He nodded, understanding the weight of her pain. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes people are so wrapped up in their own struggles that they project them onto others. That doesn't make it right, but it's not a reflection of who you are." Sarah managed a small nod, feeling the faintest glimmer of hope. She had her family, her friends, people who saw her for who she was, beyond the criticisms and judgments of one person. The next day, Sarah returned to class with a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't change Ms. Roberts, but she could hold on to the things that mattered to her. The values her parents had instilled, the strength her friends reminded her of. Ms. Roberts' approval was no longer her end goal. During a group discussion, Ms. Roberts walked past Sarah's table, her gaze lingering momentarily. "Sarah," she said, her tone as cold as ever, "I hope you've taken my feedback to heart. It would be a shame if you didn't learn from these opportunities." Sarah looked up, her voice steady but firm. "I have learned, Ms. Roberts. I've learned that I don't need someone else's approval to know my own worth." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, a flicker of surprise crossed Ms. Roberts' face. But she quickly regained her composure, offering only a curt nod before moving on. As the class continued, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't need to prove anything to Ms. Roberts. She had proven enough to herself. The classroom buzzed with a low hum as students filed in, chatting about their weekend plans. Sarah took her seat quietly, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation settle in her chest. Since her last presentation, she'd sensed a shift in the way her classmates looked at her. There was respect, an acknowledgement of her strength that hadn't been there before. As Ms. Roberts entered the room, her sharp gaze scanned the students, quickly silencing any lingering chatter. She adjusted her glasses, her expression as composed and stoic as ever. "All right, everyone," she began, her tone curt. "Today, we'll be discussing the themes of justice and morality in To Kill a Mockingbird. I want each of you to offer a unique perspective, not a regurgitation of what you've read online. I'm looking for original, insightful commentary." Sarah felt a pulse of excitement mingle with the familiar apprehension. She'd spent hours thinking about the themes, connecting them not just to the text but to her own experiences and the challenges she had faced with Ms. Roberts. She knew her insights were solid, even if Ms. Roberts dismissed them. Ms. Roberts looked around, her gaze landing on Sarah. "Sarah, why don't you start us off?" The room fell silent, every eye turning to her. Sarah took a steadying breath, feeling the warmth of her notebook beneath her hands, a grounding reminder of her preparation. "Justice in To Kill a Mockingbird isn't just about the legal system," Sarah began, her voice calm but resolute. "It's about personal morality and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the world seems against you." Atticus's decision to defend Tom Robinson wasn't only about winning a case. It was about doing what he believed was right, despite the consequences. She glanced around, noticing a few of her classmates nodding in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. The quiet approval bolstered her confidence, and she continued. "Atticus teaches Scout that empathy is a form of justice too, that understanding others is essential to fairness. It's not enough to follow laws blindly. True justice involves seeing things from another person's perspective." Ms. Roberts' expression remained impassive, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting, Sarah," she replied, her tone cool. "But don't you think that's an oversimplification? Empathy, while important, doesn't equate to justice in a legal sense. We have systems in place to ensure justice, whether people agree with the outcomes or not." Sarah felt a pang of frustration but held her ground. "I understand that, Ms. Roberts, but I believe Harper Lee was arguing that empathy and justice are interconnected. Without empathy, the law can become rigid and detached from human needs. Justice without understanding loses its humanity." The tension in the room thickened as Ms. Roberts regarded her, a slight frown creasing her brow. Sarah held her gaze, refusing to shrink back. Ms. Roberts nodded slowly, as if considering her words. A valid point, she conceded finally, her her voice edged with reluctance. However, remember that literature requires balance between interpretation and textual evidence. Be cautious not to let personal beliefs overshadow analysis. The brief acknowledgement, though minimal, felt like a victory. Sarah offered a respectful nod. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I'll keep that in mind." Around her, she sensed a ripple of quiet support from her classmates. Kyle leaned over, whispering, "That was awesome, Sarah. She actually agreed with you, kind of." Sarah couldn't help but smile, a small flicker of pride warming her chest. For once, Ms. Roberts's critique hadn't left her feeling diminished. Instead, it felt like a step forward, however small. After class, as students packed up their belongings, Kyle and Mia joined Sarah by her desk, their faces filled with admiration. "Sarah," Mia began, her voice brimming with excitement, "that was amazing. You stood your ground and didn't let her shut you down." Kyle nodded enthusiastically. "I thought she'd try to tear you apart again, but you handled it like a pro. You're kind of inspiring, you know that?" Sarah felt a rush of gratitude mixed with disbelief. She had never considered herself an inspiration, but hearing it from her friends made her heart swell with pride. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know if I'd have the courage without you guys supporting me." Mia shook her head. "Sarah, you're way stronger than you think. Ms. Roberts may be tough, but you've shown her and all of us that you're tougher." The words hung in the air, settling around Sarah like a protective cloak. She had come so far from the timid girl who had once been afraid to raise her hand. Now, she knew her voice mattered, even if Ms. Roberts couldn't or wouldn't see it. The following day, Ms. Roberts announced a new essay assignment on the role of personal accountability in literature, specifically focusing on characters whose actions shape the course of their lives. Sarah approached the assignment with renewed determination, crafting an analysis that wove together her ideas on morality, empathy, and responsibility. When Ms. Roberts handed back the essays a week later, Sarah felt her heart race as she glanced at the comments. To her surprise, Ms. Roberts had marked fewer critiques than usual, and there was a single line in the margin that caught her eye. "Well argued." It read in Ms. Roberts's neat, restrained handwriting. It was simple, understated, but to Sarah, it felt like a monumental achievement. She looked up, catching Ms. Roberts's gaze across the room. Ms. Roberts gave a brief nod before looking away, and though it was small, Sarah sensed a shift, a begrudging respect, perhaps. After class, Kyle caught up with her in the hallway, his grin wide. "Did I see that right? Ms. Roberts actually complimented your essay?" Sarah laughed, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. "I think so. It's not exactly glowing praise, but I'll take it." Mia joined them, her eyes bright. "See? She's starting to see what we all see. You didn't need her approval, but now she's the one coming around." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of Mia's words settle within her. "Maybe, but honestly, I think I'm just glad I didn't give up on myself." They walked down the hall together, their laughter echoing through the corridors, a testament to the strength Sarah had discovered within herself. As they reached the exit, Sarah looked back at the classroom one last time, a sense of closure washing over her. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more people who might try to diminish her voice. But now, she knew her worth was something she alone could define. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly free. The day felt heavy with unspoken tension as Sarah walked into the classroom, her fingers brushing the textured fabric of her notebook, grounding herself in its familiarity. She could feel the weight of Ms. Roberts's gaze the moment she entered, the intensity a reminder of every challenge and subtle insult they'd shared over the past few months. But today was different. Today, Sarah felt a calm resolve settle over her, a quiet strength that had been hard-earned. Ms. Roberts stood at the front of the class, her expression steely, though her eyes held a hint of something Sarah hadn't seen before. Curiosity, perhaps. As the students found their seats, Ms. Roberts's voice cut through the silence. "Today, we're concluding our analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird," she announced, her tone clipped. "I expect each of you to present a final insight on the theme of courage and morality. Let's avoid any simplistic views." Sarah felt her classmates shift in their seats, glancing at her as though expecting her to be the first to speak. She took a steady breath, her hands calm, and raised her hand. "Yes, Sarah?" Ms. Roberts's voice held a trace of challenge, as though daring her to falter. "Courage," Sarah began, her voice steady, "isn't about being fearless. It's about standing by your values, even when they come at a personal cost." In To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch embodies this by defending Tom Robinson, knowing the backlash he'd face. He doesn't do it for recognition or approval. He does it because it's the right thing to do. Ms. Roberts's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "And you believe that justifies his actions? What if, by taking a stand, he put his family in harm's way? Isn't courage in that case a form of recklessness?" Sarah met her gaze, unflinching. "I think courage requires a level of risk." Atticus understood that the consequences would affect him and his family, but he also knew that allowing injustice to go unchallenged would be a greater harm to his family, to his community, to himself. A few students murmured in agreement, nodding subtly. Ms. Roberts's expression softened just a fraction, her eyes holding Sarah's with a level of seriousness that felt like a private conversation in a room full of people. "And you would say that, in this world, we're obligated to uphold our values at all costs? Isn't that a rather naive view, Sarah?" Ms. Roberts's tone was measured but pointed, each word like a pinprick. Sarah felt the prickle of indignation, but she steadied herself, keeping her voice even. "No, Ms. Roberts, I don't think it's naive. I think it's necessary. Without a commitment to what we believe in, we lose who we are." Atticus wasn't naive. He was grounded, certain. He knew his identity was worth more than his reputation. Ms. Roberts's gaze held her for a long moment, an unreadable expression flickering in her eyes. The room was silent, the tension almost tangible as Ms. Roberts finally nodded. Her voice softened. "Interesting. But let's keep in mind that personal beliefs can sometimes cloud our ability to analyze objectively," she said, her tone less severe. "Thank you, Sarah." As she moved on to the next student, Sarah exhaled quietly, the feeling of victory settling over her like a soft blanket. She had stood her ground, unshaken by the usual barbs and challenges. Around her, classmates exchanged looks, some nodding in silent approval. When the class ended, Sarah packed her things slowly, her fingers brushing the edges of her notebook as she gathered her strength. She sensed Ms. Roberts's presence as the room emptied, the faint sound of her heels clicking against the floor until the silence enveloped them both. "Sarah," Ms. Roberts's voice broke the quiet, softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" Sarah looked up, meeting her teacher's gaze, and nodded. She walked over to the desk, feeling the space between them shrink, the atmosphere charged with an intensity that was both familiar and unfamiliar. Ms. Roberts took a breath, her hand resting on a stack of papers as if for support. "I've noticed a change in you over these past months. You've shown resilience, a depth I hadn't expected." The words caught Sarah off guard. She had braced herself for criticism, a reprimand. But this acknowledgement was unexpected, even disarming. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I've learned a lot in this class, not just about literature, but about how to hold on to my own beliefs." Ms. Roberts's gaze softened, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk. "Passion is admirable, Sarah. But remember, academia requires a balance of passion and objectivity." Sarah nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I understand, but I also think that passion and objectivity can coexist. Literature isn't just about analysis. It's about feeling the words, understanding the human experience behind them." Ms. Roberts's lips curved slightly, a hint of a smile that barely reached her eyes. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who shared that same determination, that same belief in ideals." There was a hint of vulnerability in her voice, a crack in the armor that Sarah had never seen before. For the first time, she saw Ms. Roberts not just as a teacher, but as a person, someone with her own struggles and defenses. "Was it someone you respected?" Sarah asked softly, sensing the shift. Ms. Roberts's gaze flickered, her jaw tightening slightly before she nodded. "Yes, someone I respected a great deal, but someone who paid a price for their idealism." Sarah held her gaze, understanding now that Ms. Roberts's challenges weren't just directed at her. They were born of her own experiences, her own disappointments. "Maybe that's why you push us so hard," she said quietly. "Because you want us to be ready for the world outside these walls." Ms. Roberts's expression softened, a look of almost reluctant admiration in her eyes. "Perhaps. But resilience doesn't come from ease, Sarah. It comes from friction, from being tested." Sarah took a deep breath, the air thick with a mix of tension and understanding. "I know, and I appreciate it, even if I didn't understand it before." Ms. Roberts regarded her, a hint of something warmer in her gaze. "You've proven yourself, Sarah, not just as a student, but as someone willing to stand for what they believe, regardless of the cost. Don't lose that. The world will try to shape you, but never let it mold you beyond recognition." Sarah nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I won't." There was a brief silence, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Ms. Roberts gave a small nod, her gaze steady. "Very well. I look forward to seeing where that strength takes you." Sarah turned to leave, her heart light. The weight of doubt finally lifted. She had faced her greatest challenge, not by yielding, but by remaining true to herself. And as she walked out of the classroom, she knew that she carried with her not only the lessons of literature, but the knowledge that she was enough, just as she was. The classroom felt different that day, lighter somehow, as if a collective weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Sarah noticed it the moment she walked in, the usual quiet murmur of voices now mingling with soft laughter and easy conversation. Her fingers brushed the worn leather of her notebook as she took her seat, feeling the comfort of familiarity settle around her. Mia slid into the seat beside her, giving her a warm smile. "You ready for today?" she whispered, her tone teasing but affectionate. Sarah smiled back, a quiet confidence filling her. "I think so. I feel good." Before Mia could reply, Ms. Roberts entered, her presence as commanding as ever. Yet today her expression held a contemplative quality, her usual briskness tempered by something softer. "Today, we'll conclude our unit on To Kill a Mockingbird with an open discussion on the lessons we've taken from the novel," she announced, her voice even. "I want to hear what each of you feels is the story's most powerful message. Don't hold back." A few students exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of excitement and nerves. Kyle, seated a few rows back, was the first to raise his hand. "For me," he began, his voice steady, "the story's about understanding people beyond the surface. Atticus says that you never really understand someone until you walk around in their shoes. That stuck with me because, well, I think we often judge people without knowing what they're going through." Ms. Roberts gave a nod, her gaze shifting slightly to Sarah. "Insightful, Kyle." "And Sarah," she continued, her tone inviting, "what would you say is the novel's most impactful message?" Sarah felt a wave of calm wash over her as she met Ms. Roberts's gaze. The usual tension was gone, replaced with a sense of respect, as if Ms. Roberts was genuinely interested in her answer. "I think it's about integrity," Sarah began, her voice clear. "Atticus could have walked away from defending Tom Robinson. It would have been easier, safer, but he didn't, because he knew what was right. Integrity isn't just doing what's expected. It's standing by your values, even when it's difficult." A few students nodded in agreement, and Sarah could feel their support, a subtle but tangible presence that strengthened her resolve. Mia leaned forward, her voice carrying an edge of excitement. "It's like what Sarah's been saying all along. Sometimes, you have to stand up, even if you're standing alone. That's real courage." The room was quiet, each student taking in her words. Sarah felt a swell of emotion, realizing how much her journey had resonated with those around her. The support was more than silent this time. It was vocal, affirming. Ms. Roberts's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Courage and integrity are indeed difficult paths to walk," she said quietly. "And it's a reminder that strength isn't always loud. Often, it's in quiet resilience." Her words hung in the air, an acknowledgement not only of Atticus Finch, but, Sarah sensed, of her own journey. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of closure. After class, as students began to pack up, Kyle approached Sarah, his expression earnest. "Sarah, I just wanted to say, watching you handle everything this semester, with Ms. Roberts and all, it's been kind of amazing. You've shown us what it means to not give up." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, touched by his sincerity. "Thank you, Kyle. That means a lot. I didn't realize that it was having an effect on anyone else." He laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, it did. I think we all learned something just from seeing how you handled everything." Mia, who had been listening nearby, grinned. "You're practically a hero around here, Sarah. We've all been watching you stand up for yourself, and it's been inspiring. You showed us that our voices matter too." Sarah looked around, seeing nods from other classmates, their faces full of respect. Jenna, usually quiet and reserved, approached, her voice soft but full of warmth. "I've always been scared to speak up in class," Jenna admitted, glancing down. "But watching you, I realized that maybe it's okay to be heard. You've given me courage, Sarah." Sarah's heart swelled, her chest tightening with emotion. She had fought so hard to stand her ground, to prove her worth to herself. She hadn't anticipated that her journey would inspire others. "Thank you, Jenna," Sarah said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I'm so glad that my story could mean something to you." Jenna nodded, her gaze warm. "It means a lot. You showed us that we don't have to be afraid to be ourselves." As they made their way out of the classroom, Mia walked beside Sarah, her arm looped through hers, their steps in sync. "You did it, Sarah," Mia said, her voice a mixture of pride and admiration. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed all of us what strength really looks like." Sarah looked at her friend, feeling a depth of gratitude that words couldn't capture. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mia. You were there through everything, always encouraging me." Mia squeezed her arm, her eyes bright. "That's what friends are for. And now, you know who you are, no matter what anyone else says." They walked down the hall together, laughter spilling between them, a testament to the journey they had shared. Sarah felt a sense of belonging, a connection to those around her that went beyond shared classes and daily routines. As they reached the exit, Sarah looked back at the classroom one last time, feeling a mixture of pride and peace. She knew there would be other challenges, other people who might doubt her, but she also knew that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. "Let's go celebrate," Mia suggested, nudging her with a grin. "You've earned it, Sarah. You're a legend now." Sarah laughed, feeling the joy and freedom of knowing she had faced her greatest challenges and come out stronger. She was ready for whatever came next, her heart light, her spirit unbreakable. The final days of the semester came with a flurry of activity. Hallways filled with the hum of students chatting about vacation plans, the smell of old textbooks mingling with fresh notes in the air. Sarah walked through the crowd, her steps steady and unhurried. She could feel the weight of the past few months falling away, replaced by a newfound clarity that resonated in every fiber of her being. As she entered her literature classroom for one of the last sessions, she took a moment to breathe it all in. The familiar worn seats, the stacks of papers on Ms. Roberts' desk, even the soft creak of the old floorboards. This space, once a battleground of self-doubt and frustration, now felt like a quiet testament to her resilience. Mia slipped into the seat beside her, her eyes bright with excitement. "I can't believe we're almost done. Doesn't it feel like a lifetime ago when we were just trying to survive Ms. Roberts' critiques?" Sarah laughed, a genuine, easy sound. "I know what you mean. It's strange. I used to dread every minute here, but now, it just feels like another part of my story. Something I wouldn't change." Mia nudged her playfully. "Well, you should be proud. You turned this whole experience around and showed everyone what real strength looks like." Before Sarah could reply, Ms. Roberts entered the room, her expression calm but not as severe as it once was. She placed her books on the desk and looked around at the class with a sense of finality. "As we wrap up this semester," Ms. Roberts began, her voice steady, "I want each of you to share one takeaway from this class, something that will stick with you beyond these walls." A silence fell over the room as students glanced at each other, their expressions thoughtful. Slowly, hands began to rise, one after another, as students shared their reflections. Finally, Ms. Roberts's gaze landed on Sarah, a quiet expectation in her eyes. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the attention of the room settle on her. This class taught me that strength isn't about avoiding challenges or pleasing everyone. It's about holding on to your beliefs, even when they're tested. Literature showed me how stories can help us find our own voices, and how sometimes the hardest journey is standing up for who we are. Ms. Roberts held her gaze, a flicker of something warm passing over her expression. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. "Thank you, Sarah. That's a lesson worth carrying forward." After the class ended, Sarah lingered by her desk, waiting as her classmates filed out. She could feel the familiar presence of Ms. Roberts, who approached with a quiet, almost reflective air. "You've come a long way, Sarah," Ms. Roberts said, her voice softer than usual. "I know our time together wasn't easy, but I hope you can see that challenges are sometimes the best teachers." Sarah looked at her, meeting her gaze directly. "I do see that, and in a way, I'm grateful for it. You taught me to find my own strength, to rely on what I believe in, even when it wasn't easy." Ms. Roberts's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. "Good. That's something that will serve you well in life. Don't ever lose it." They shared a brief silence, a quiet understanding that felt like the closing of a chapter. Sarah nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Thank you, Ms. Roberts, for everything." With that, she turned and left the room, her steps light, carrying with her the lessons of both resilience and self-belief. That evening, Sarah found herself in a situation she hadn't anticipated. She had been invited to join a small group of students from different grades, organized by the school's guidance counselor, to discuss ideas for improving student life. The group was set to meet in the library, a space that buzzed with activity even in the late afternoon. As Sarah entered, she noticed a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces, each looking equally curious and slightly nervous. She took a seat at the round table, feeling a sense of ease that would have been foreign to her only months ago. The guidance counselor, Mr. Lawson, began by welcoming everyone. "Thank you all for coming. This is a chance for each of you to share ideas, voice any concerns, and think about how we can make our school a better place for everyone." He glanced around the table, his gaze landing on each student. "I want this to be a place where everyone feels comfortable sharing. No idea is too small or too bold." There was a pause as students exchanged glances, each seemingly waiting for someone else to go first. Finally, a junior named Ryan spoke up, suggesting an idea for a student mentorship program to help younger students adapt to high school life. One by one, others chimed in, offering ideas ranging from more student-led clubs to mental health resources. As each voice joined the conversation, Sarah listened, noting how passionate each student was about creating a positive impact. Then, as a moment of quiet settled over the group, Mr. Lawson looked at Sarah, his expression encouraging. "Sarah, you've had quite a journey this year. I'd love to hear your perspective." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her, the kind that came from knowing her voice was valued. She met Mr. Lawson's gaze, then looked around the table, seeing the anticipation in her peers' eyes. "Well," she began, choosing her words thoughtfully, "I think a big part of improving student life is helping people feel seen and understood. There's a lot of pressure to fit in, to be what people expect. I'd love to see a space where students can just be themselves." A murmur of agreement went around the table, and Sarah continued, feeling her confidence grow. "Maybe we could create a peer support program where students can talk about their experiences and support each other. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to listen." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's actually a really good idea. I know a lot of people who'd appreciate something like that." Another student, a freshman named Lila, chimed in, "Yeah, I remember feeling so lost at the beginning of the year. It would have been amazing to have someone to talk to who understood what I was going through." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Exactly. Sometimes we just need a reminder that we're not alone, that there's someone who gets it." Mr. Lawson looked at her with admiration. "That's a powerful insight, Sarah. It sounds like you're advocating for something that goes beyond school. It's about building a community, The group spent the next hour discussing ways to bring Sarah's idea to life, each person contributing ideas, sharing stories, and laughing together. Sarah felt a deep sense of connection, realizing that she had become part of something bigger than herself. She had moved from self-doubt to self-belief, and now she was helping others find their own voices. As the meeting wrapped up, Mr. Lawson approached her, a warm smile on his face. "You've inspired a lot of people, Sarah. I hope you realize that." She nodded, a quiet but firm confidence in her expression. "Thank you, Mr. Lawson. I think I finally understand what it means to believe in myself." The arrival of spring had transformed the school grounds, filling the air with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm, golden patches across the floors as Sarah walked down the hallway toward the auditorium. Today was the end of semester celebration, and she had been asked to give a speech, a thought that would have terrified her just months ago. But today, she felt a calm confidence flowing through her veins. She clutched her note cards, fingers brushing against the edges as if grounding herself in their texture. Each word on those cards held a piece of her journey, each phrase a reminder of the growth she had fought so hard to achieve. Mia appeared by her side, her eyes bright with excitement. "Are you nervous?" she asked, grinning. Sarah laughed, feeling the warmth of her friend's presence like a steadying hand. "A little, but it's the good kind of nervous. It feels like closure, you know?" Mia squeezed her arm. "Well, if anyone can inspire this crowd, it's you. I've seen you grow through all of this, and I know you're going to blow them away." Sarah smiled, the encouragement swelling her heart. She took a deep breath and straightened, feeling ready. The auditorium was filled to capacity, the buzz of voices and laughter mingling in the air. Students, teachers, and parents settled into their seats as the principal, Mr. Thompson, took the stage, his voice echoing as he introduced the event. "Today, we're here to celebrate not only academic accomplishments but also personal growth," he announced, looking over the audience with pride. "We have students among us who have faced challenges with resilience and courage. One of those students is here to share her story with us today. Please welcome Sarah Parker." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt a surge of warmth as she walked to the stage, her steps steady. She glanced out at the audience, catching the supportive smiles of her friends and the encouraging nods from her parents seated near the front. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, letting the silence settle before she began. "When I started this year," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I never imagined I'd be standing here, sharing my story. To be honest, I didn't think I even had a story to tell. I was just a girl trying to fit in, trying to do what was expected." She looked around, seeing nods of understanding. "But then, I was faced with challenges that forced me to question everything I thought I knew. About myself, about my worth, about my voice." Sarah paused, the silence amplifying the weight of her words. "I had a teacher who challenged me in ways I didn't understand at first. And honestly, I thought those challenges were meant to hold me back. But what I learned is that they were actually there to test my strength, to make me realize what I was capable of." She took a breath, steadying herself as she continued. "In that process, I discovered something essential, the value of my own voice. Our opinions, our beliefs, they matter. Even when others make us doubt that, we have to hold on to who we are." Soft applause rippled through the crowd, and Sarah felt encouraged to continue, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And the most amazing thing," she said, her eyes bright, "was seeing that when I found my voice, I helped others find theirs too. My journey wasn't just mine, it was ours. All of us, at some point, have to fight to be heard, to be recognized." She let the silence linger before she spoke her final words. "So, my hope for everyone here is that you never let anyone silence your voice, no matter how hard it is, because the world needs people who believe in who they are." As she finished, the applause erupted, filling the auditorium with a warmth that made Sarah's eyes misty. She looked out at the familiar faces in the crowd, each of them a part of her story, each of them a reminder of the strength she had found within herself. After the event, Sarah was surrounded by friends, family, and even a few teachers, each of them expressing words of admiration and pride. Mia was the first to reach her, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were amazing, Sarah." Mia's voice was filled with pride. "I knew you'd blow everyone away." Sarah laughed, still feeling the energy from the stage. "Thank you, Mia. I couldn't have done it without you and everyone else supporting me." Kyle stepped forward next, holding out his hand, but quickly turned it into a hug. "You gave us all something to believe in, Sarah. Watching you go through all that and come out stronger. It's more than inspiring." Jenna, who was usually quiet, approached with a shy smile, her eyes bright with admiration. "Sarah, you taught me it's okay to be myself, to speak up even when it's hard." "Thank you for that." Sarah's heart swelled, each word from her friends feeling like a gift. She had fought so hard to stand up for herself, not realizing that her journey would resonate with others as much as it did. "Thank you, Jenna," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad that my story could mean something to you." Jenna nodded, her expression warm. "It does. You showed us that we don't have to be afraid to be ourselves." As the crowd began to thin, Sarah noticed Ms. Roberts standing nearby, observing the scene with a contemplative expression. There was a calmness to her posture, a quiet pride that softened her usual severity. Feeling an impulse, Sarah approached her teacher, curious to share a final exchange with the person who had, unknowingly, set her on this path. "Ms. Roberts," Sarah began, offering a gentle smile. "Thank you for everything. I know it wasn't easy, but I think it was exactly what I needed." Ms. Roberts looked at her with an unreadable expression, but her eyes held something that looked like respect. "You've come a long way, Sarah. Sometimes, the hardest lessons aren't the ones we read in books. They're the ones we live." Sarah nodded, a feeling of gratitude swelling in her chest. "I think I understand that now, and I'm grateful for the challenges. They made me stronger." Ms. Roberts's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, genuine and rare. "Good. That's a lesson worth keeping close. Don't ever forget it." They shared a moment of silence, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. Then, with a slight nod, Ms. Roberts walked away, leaving Sarah with a sense of closure that felt complete. As Sarah left the auditorium that evening, she felt a lightness, a freedom she hadn't experienced before. She had faced her fears, conquered her doubts, and found her voice, and now she was ready for whatever lay ahead. Walking beside Mia, who was excitedly chatting about summer plans, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of an even greater journey. She glanced back at the auditorium one last time, smiling as she let go of everything she had once feared, because now she knew that her strength, her voice, and her worth were hers to hold, and no one could ever take that away. Sarah's journey from self-doubt to self-assurance has become more than just her own story. It's a beacon of resilience for those around her. By facing each challenge with unwavering integrity, she not only transforms herself but also ignites a change within her community. This story reminds us that the courage to be ourselves is one of life's greatest strengths, and that true empowerment begins with believing in our voice. As Sarah moves forward, her journey stands as a testament to the power of self-belief, proving that in a world full of noise, staying true to oneself is the ultimate triumph. If Sarah's story moved you, let us know in the comments below. What moments stood out to you? Do you believe in the power of standing up for what's right? Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Together, let's share and celebrate the courage it takes to find your own voice.